Initially, it truly is a brothers' war. It's a war between two very similar cultures, officered, both armies are officered by West Point graduates, people who have a common military education, and by politicians who knew each other before the war and had interacted often in the halls of Congress. And so the war is fought with strict limits on the amount of violence, the amount of danger that people are expected to confront. On the battlefield, you might expect to have a brief, sharp engagement between rival regiments or artillery batteries, but then people will take care of soldiers on the other side if they're wounded, or respect the rules of war, I suppose, respect strict limits on when it's appropriate to apply violence. And certainly, war against civilians, and that includes both civilians directly and their property in the form of slaves, is strictly off limits at the beginning of the war. So it's a war with very clearly understood boundaries for the first couple of years. That begins to change right around the Battle of Antietam. Antietam is somewhat of a watershed moment in the Civil War, not only because it has major political ramifications, but it changes the way both sides, and especially the Union, look at the war. The Lincoln administration begins to realize that trying to defeat the Confederacy solely on the battlefield by gaining victory over its major armies isn't going to be a particularly easy job. And so they begin to take the war to the home front. They begin to go after property. They begin to go after the means of production, both in terms of slave labor and in terms of agriculture, and generally to make the Southern population feel what historians have described as the hard hand of war, to bring the war home to Southern communities. After Antietam, quite a bit changes. In terms of pure military perception and military strategy, the North begins to design campaigns that will penetrate deep into the heart of the South and not only try to bring armies to battle, but also to damage the ability of Southern civilians to raise agricultural crops and produce the technology necessary to actually fight a war. Secondly, Lincoln begins to realize that taking a crack at the Confederacy's vulnerable slave population is going to be a part of his strategy. Perhaps the best-known feature of the Battle of Antietam is that it gives Lincoln grounds to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he promises that if the Southern Confederacy doesn't come back into the Union, all slaves remaining in the Confederacy will henceforth be free. Lincoln's doing that for a couple of reasons. One is to strike a blow directly at the Confederate industrial complex, if you will, keep them from being able to raise enough food, raise enough supplies, produce enough munitions in order to fight this war. The other is to demoralize Southern civilians, make them fearful, make them concerned about a potential uprising of their formerly enslaved population. Other outcomes for the Lincoln administration include a greater awareness of what the war might be about. Initially, the war is perceived as a conflict simply over the position of states relative to the federal government. Now Lincoln is beginning to shift the conversation a little bit, slowly but surely, toward a broader conversation about what freedom might mean and what citizenship ultimately constitutes in the United States, who can be a citizen and what terms citizenship offers to Americans. People saw this war primarily in two major formats. They heard about it personally from loved ones, neighbors. They also learned of it through the popular press, which is primarily a print medium until the Civil War. People begin to see not only print media, but first lithographs and eventually photographs coming to them as real-time depictions, literal depictions of what combat does to people during the Civil War, really for the first time in the United States. And so that changes how people perceive the war. It's no longer simply words. It's now images as well. And that has a huge impact on the home front, on what people think war is. Antietam is photographed by several major photographers on both sides, among them Alexander Gardner, prominent northern photographer. The most famous photographs of Antietam, though, are displayed in the gallery belonging to Matthew Brady, whose New York gallery is sort of a site of public culture in the Civil War years. It's a place where you can go to find out what the latest war looks like, kind of the equivalent of a newsreel or other mass media technology of the 20th century for the 19th, for the Civil War. So Gardner and Brady are the ways in which the public is going to see some of the war's photographs, especially for the Battle of Antietam, firsthand. People begin to see that combat is quite deadly, which seems like a basic assumption to us, but we live in a photographic age. We live in an image-based age. People in the Civil War were just entering that period, and so when they begin to see that, they begin to push for a harder war to bring about a more swift conclusion. All right, they also begin to push for a more punitive war. Instead of seeing the South as their brothers, Northern politicians and generals begin to see the South as an enemy, as someone who's done quite severe carnage to the young men of Northern society. And so there's a push for a war that's going to bring about lasting results. That's going to mean not only the destruction of slavery, but also the destruction of the Southern way of life.
At our coming, we had found an old-fashioned country neighborhood, the people living in peace. We left it with homes, fields, and forests marred, shattered, devastated, and ruined.
More than 400 Minnesotans fought at the Battle of Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single day of any war in American history. Today, thousands of visitors annually retrace the steps of Civil War soldiers.
Antietam National Battlefield is one of the most pristine battlefields in the National Park Service inventory. You can go out and behold the battlefield and see it the way it looked 150 years ago.
"18 months into the Civil War, this is the first time Confederate forces invade the North. Farms and factories in the South have been badly damaged, and Lee desperately needs to resupply his army. The Confederates have established a 1,000-mile front from Chesapeake Bay to the Mississippi River. If Lee plays his cards right, Maryland could become a star on the Confederate flag. President Lincoln leaves nothing to chance. He has suspended the writ of habeas corpus, meaning that criminal suspects can be held without being charged, and prevented the state's legislature from meeting.
Looking backwards over our shoulders, he's the great emancipator. But if you look at a map, you know why Abraham Lincoln is treading so heavily on the people of Maryland. And that's because if Maryland falls, Washington falls.
The 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry is part of the 2nd Corps. Under the command of Colonel Alfred Sully, it is organized into 10 companies, along with the 2nd Minnesota Sharpshooters. Minnesotans had been the first to volunteer for the Union Army, and by now, they are battle-tested. Up early the morning of September 17, 1862, they will cross Antietam Creek, a cornfield, and a major crossroads before encountering the Confederates in the West Woods.
The 1st Minnesota Infantry is moving closer and closer to the fight. Now they emerge on what would have been an awesome, bloody scene on the morning of the battle.
The dead and wounded lay thick, many begging us for a drink of water, others telling us not to tread on them. And it was difficult to march over the ground without stepping on some man.
In the space of 4 hours in this field here, 8,000 casualties. We're at the western edge of the cornfield. The regiment is still in a line moving towards the West Woods. They're going to hit the Hagerstown Pike. This is one of the most famous fences in the Civil War. There's many pictures by Alexander Gardner of the Louisiana soldiers tangled up in this fence.
Sully finally leads the regiment into the West Woods. It is about this time that Lee's reserves begin to hit the 1st Minnesota hard, and the men begin to fall in the Confederate fire.
The man to my right gave a quick "oh" and dropped his hands onto the part of his body that had been hit. But dropping his gun, he was able to limp to the rear, and a splinter from the rail of my fence, hitting me in the face, said, "You're next."
The West Woods was the furthest advance for the 1st Minnesota before the order to retreat and regroup.
They're retreating through these series of rock ledges and fences back towards the North Woods part of the battlefield.
When we were only about halfway up the slight rise of ground over which we were retreating, Sully gave the order to face and fire, with the result that a solid volley from about 300 muskets poured into the following enemy and caused a quite appreciable check to their oncoming.
The single day's battle resulted in more than 23,000 casualties, with heavy losses on both sides.
If the horrors of war cannot be seen on this battlefield, they can't be seen anywhere.
Charlie Goddard spoke for thousands of men who fought at this place. The 1st Minnesota brought 435 men to this battlefield. 17 were killed, 79 were wounded, and 24 were missing. That's over 1 in 4 men who never made it out of here intact.
At a terrific cost, Lee's invasion of the North had failed. His army retreated to southern soil. After waiting months for a Union victory, Lincoln used the opportunity to issue a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. 150 years later, Minnesotans continue to remember the men who fought at Antietam.
Edmund St. Pierre enlisted as a private on September 30th, 1861. He was killed in the cornfield.
We have to, as the citizens of our state, do everything that we can to make sure that we're preserving these grave sites and gravestones so future generations can be reminded, can remember, and then they can interpret this for themselves.
When we talk about decisive battles and turning points in the war, Antietam was near the top of the list, because for the first time, freedom becomes an objective of the war.